It was a typical Monday morning at Delmore Industries, sleek, towering tech company located in downtown Chicago. Employees rushed through the revolving glass doors, lattes in hand, eyes glued to their phones, minds already halfway into their meetings. Nobody paid much attention to George, the janitor, who quietly pushed his mop bucket down the hall. For most of the employees, George was invisible. He was in his late 60s, always wore the same faded gray overalls, and spoke only when spoken to, every day without fail. George arrived an hour before anyone else and stayed an hour later. He scrubbed toilets, cleaned up after messy office parties, and even unclogged drains that no one else would touch. And he did it all without a word of complaint. But what no one knew, not the interns, not the managers, and certainly not the CEO, was that George had a secret, one that would shake the entire company to its core. On that particular day, everything changed. The marketing team had just wrapped up a major presentation in the 12th floor boardroom. Trays of half-eaten food, spilled coffee, and discarded papers littered the space. George arrived, as always, after the meeting to clean up the mess. As he bent down to pick up a crumpled napkin near the CEO's chair, the room's door burst open. It was Mr. Calloway, the company's notoriously arrogant VP of operations. He stopped in his tracks, glared at George and snarled, "What the hell are you doing in here?" Before George could respond, Calloway stepped closer and added, "You people think you can just wander anywhere you want? This room is for executives, not janitors." Several employees froze outside the glass walls, watching the scene unfold. George calmly replied, "I'm just cleaning, sir." But that only made Calloway angrier. "You're fired," he shouted, pointing toward the door. "Get out before I call security." The room went silent. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. George looked up from where he knelt beside the conference table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. Instead, he stood up slowly, wiped his hands on his apron, and simply said, "Are you sure you want to do that, Mr. Calloway?" Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd of employees, now gathering outside the boardroom. Calloway scoffed, "I don't need to double-check before firing someone who doesn't belong here." George stared at him, unwavering. Then, with remarkable composure, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys, then a slim, worn leather wallet. Inside was a photo of him standing next to an older man in front of the Delmore Industries logo. The older man was Joseph Delmore, the founder of the company. "Joseph was my brother," George said quietly, "and I'm the majority shareholder." Gasps filled the air. Phones were subtly pulled out to record the moment. Mr. Calloway's smirk vanished. "You're lying," he stammered. "That's impossible." But George was already pulling out documents, proof of his shares, a letter from the board, and a photo taken at the company's groundbreaking ceremony 40 years ago, where a younger George stood beside his brother. "I stepped down years ago after Joseph passed," George explained. "I wanted to see the company from the ground level, to see how the people are treated when they're not wearing suits or ties." He looked around at the stunned crowd. "And now I know." Silence reigned. The employees who once looked through George now looked at him with awe. The invisible janitor had just revealed himself as the king in plain clothes. George Delmore had co-founded the company with his brother in the early 1980s. While Joseph was the public face, charismatic and bold, George was the strategist, the one who managed internal affairs, investments, and culture. After Joseph's sudden passing, George remained on the board, but chose to step away from public leadership. He had watched the company grow from afar. Its profits soared, but something didn't sit right. Complaints about toxic culture, discrimination, and corporate arrogance began surfacing online. So George devised a plan. He would re-enter the company under the radar. For 2 years, he worked as a janitor, quietly observing, taking notes, watching who treated people with dignity, and who didn't. Calloway had failed that test spectacularly. Back in the present moment, George turned to the HR director who had rushed into the boardroom. "Effective immediately," George said. "Mr. Calloway is terminated for misconduct." Calloway tried to argue, but George cut him off. "There's footage, witnesses, and this isn't your first complaint. You treat people like dirt. That's not the culture I built." The HR director nodded solemnly. Within minutes, security escorted Calloway out, just as he had threatened to do to George. Employees whispered and stared in disbelief. as the man who thought he ruled the office was humiliated in front of everyone. George stood still, watching, but his expression didn't show satisfaction, just quiet resolution. Justice, not revenge. After the dust settled, employees began to approach George, not as a janitor but as a leader. Some apologized for how they had treated him or ignored him. Others asked for advice. George took it all in, humble as ever. "We all make mistakes," he said, "but what matters is whether we learn from them." He announced plans to spend the next few months evaluating the company culture, meeting with employees one-on-one, and ensuring every worker, from janitor to executive, was treated with respect. "Titles don't make you better," he said. "Your actions do." Over the following weeks, Delmore Industries underwent a quiet revolution. Managers were retrained, internal systems were revamped, and new ethics policies were rolled out. George remained in his coveralls, walking the halls every morning, still cleaning up, still listening. Employees found it strange at first, having the owner of the company mopping floors. But eventually it became a symbol, a reminder that leadership isn't about power, it's about service. Productivity went up, resignations dropped. Delmore became known not just for its tech products, but for its people-first culture. News of the Janitor CEO spread like wildfire. Business blogs, leadership podcasts, and even major networks covered George's story. He didn't seek the attention, but he used the spotlight to talk about equity, humility, and the power of walking in others' shoes. Other CEOs began to ask him for advice. George just smiled and said, "Start by saying thank you to your janitor." Internally, George started a mentorship program that paired executives with entry-level workers, encouraging empathy and cross-department understanding. In his final year at the company before fully retiring, George held a town hall. He wore a suit that day, not the overalls. He stood on stage and addressed hundreds of employees. "I walked these halls as a janitor, and I learned more about this company than I ever did from a boardroom. Remember that no one is beneath you, and everyone has a story." The crowd erupted into applause. As he stepped down from the stage, one employee whispered to another, "He changed everything." And he had, not just the company but the lives within it.